All right, guys, so I'm going to open with a quote from a trip report on Belladonna, which is a plant in the nightshade family with effects that are very similar to the psychoactive compound that this video is dedicated to, which is 3-quin-nucleotidyl benzilate, also abbreviated as QNB or BZ, called Buzz for short. So one thing to note about the effects of belladonna and the other alkaloids and synthetic compounds with similar effects that we'll be talking about today is, unlike the vast majority of psychoactive and a subset of psychoactive compounds that we refer to as psychedelic, these compounds, including QNB, the one we're focusing on today, can impair you to such an extent that you forget that you've taken or been administered a psychoactive substance. So that is a huge distinction between this belladonna trip experience and, say, the experience of someone who has taken LSD or psilocybin, the active agent in magic mushrooms. And I just ask you to keep that in mind as we go through these psychoactive chemicals today. This person interpreted what they were experiencing as dreams. In fact, they had been a lucid dreamer for most of their life, and because of that, they thought that all of these hallucinations that they were having as they suffered through this kind of belladonna-induced delirium were simply a lucid dream, an extended lucid dream that they were trapped in, a nightmare that they couldn't get out of, if you will. So this is their quote, okay? At one point, I was suddenly on my aunt's tree swing telling this girl, A, who was my first girlfriend, that I didn't want to sing at her funeral. Another part of the trip was talking to my old baseball coach who died in a snowmobile accident when I was 13, asking him how I get out of here. He started walking towards me, and suddenly I got scared, and even though I was saying, this is just a dream, I couldn't get him to stop coming at me, and I couldn't even move my legs. I started to scream, and then he finally looked like he was walking away. So these compounds, these belladonna alkaloids in a similar plant called datura, these are known for inducing really dark trips. They sometimes involve interactions with dark, malevolent entities that some people, depending on their spiritual beliefs, interpret as demons. It's a lot of horrifying encounters with dead people, often real people from the person who's tripping from their past, and it is overall, most people who take these kind of psychoactive agents have at least one experience that makes them really hesitate to take them again because it is so incredibly dark. I've even heard of belladonna or belladonna alkaloid trips involving interactions with entities who have encouraged the people who are tripping to either hurt themselves or hurt other people. So there's a reason why there is so much hesitation and so much warning and advice to give caution when dealing with this set of maybe a dozen psychoactive alkaloids or synthetic compounds with similar effects. So we're going to talk more in detail about what Buzz, this compound that we're focusing on today, what it does to people who are tripping on it, and you're going to see more of this scary stuff. And unlike with something like LSD or, say, psilocybin, which again is the active alkaloid in magic mushrooms, unlike with those chemicals, these dark, really nasty and malevolent feeling trips, they're not the exception. They're not the occasional bad trip that reinforces the rule of, in general, they're sort of euphoric, mind expanding experiences, as you see again with hallucinogens like LSD and magic mushrooms. These are more the rule. The negative, really scary experiences are as common or even more common than positive sort of experiences that might feel like they're actually, again, expanding your mind or giving you some constructive realization to take away from the experience. So pretty scary stuff. And again, we'll get into in detail what I mean by that. So in terms of why I'm making this video today, I went down a really long, very dark rabbit hole. So we have in this YouTube channel, we have our Druggy Book of the Month Club. And we've done an addiction memoir. We did Kat Marnell's How to Murder Your Life. Before that, I did a book by German journalist Norman Ohler called what was it called? Blitzed, the history of drug use in the Third Reich. And then last month I did a book about Ken Kesey's psychedelic band, the Merry Pranksters, who traveled throughout the US and Mexico taking speed and acid at a time when almost no one had access to acid and a lot of other psychoactive chemicals. The book was by journalist Tom Wolfe. It was written in the new journalism Gonzo style. It's actually a nonfiction book, although it very much reads like fiction. And that book is called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. And in that book, they mention a compound called Ditran. Now, Ditran is a very strong anticholinergic compound. I'm going to talk about what that means in a minute. It's similar to QNB, BZ, the chemical that I'm going to be talking about today. And the way that Wolfe summarized the effects of Ditran was, quote unquote, always a bad trip. So I started researching Ditran and learning about the military experiments and the government projects at Stanford and other universities that were exploring the potential wartime uses of chemicals like Ditran. And I just sort of broadened out to a wider set of chemicals that I was investigating, and then went really, really in depth with these psychoactive anticholinergic compounds that were considered some of the most promising chemical agents in terms of being able to incapacitate huge numbers of civilians or even enemy troops without killing them and rendering them completely unable to really do anything, to even execute basic military maneuvers, to operate their firearms, things like that. So I went down quite the rabbit hole, and I think that it was so interesting that I just kind of had to share it, basically. So if you haven't watched any of my videos before, a real quick introduction. My name is Brian. I am a science teacher who has taught both biology and chemistry. I also run an addiction and recovery blog called the Concrete Confessional Blog, and I'm working on a series of videos on ibogaine, specifically its use in treating opioid addiction, and some other sort of esoteric or atypical psychedelic and deliriant compounds. And so this topic for today's video kind of came out of nowhere, but it does fit with the overall arc of some of the content on my channel. So I figured, why not? Again, I think that you guys will find this really interesting too. So the other thing I forgot to mention about Ditran was that it and some of these other anticholinergic compounds were actually investigated as ways to model schizophrenia. So Ditran in particular was used to induce short-term psychotic episodes and to mimic symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia to an extent and an accuracy that no other agent had been able to replicate up to that point. And if you know anything about scientific research, you know that having an animal model, and particularly a model that you can use in more intelligent animals, other mammals, for example, is absolutely essential to breakthroughs in understanding the pathology, which then enable you to develop effective treatments. So the Ditran and some of these other anticholinergic compounds that really reliably induced what looked like paranoid schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, it was thought that these might even usher in a new era of being able to study schizophrenia in a much more effective, immediately applicable way. It didn't really pan out, partly because a lot of these experiments were shut down for ethical reasons, and partly because the sort of modeling of schizophrenia that they were able to create or develop using these compounds wasn't really as on target as they had initially thought it would be. And I'm going to explain later on in the video what that means. But basically, in schizophrenia, you usually have thematic consistency, meaning that the delusions a given schizophrenic person is having are long-term and consistent, and they all kind of fit with each other. Whereas when you're inducing psychosis with the type of anticholinergic agent that we're going to talk about today, it's all over the place. It's only for part of the person's, again, multi-day trip in the case of BZ, and for that reason there's a lot of limited efficacy, even if you can get it to work kind of like you want it to work, which it doesn't on many people. So again, today we're not talking about Ditran. We are talking about a similar compound called 3-quinnucleotidyl benzilate. We're going to abbreviate that as QNB or BZ because of that BZ sort of nickname, it was also called Buzz by the researchers. So when I'm talking about the researchers, experiments on QNB, on BZ, were conducted. They were part of the Edgewood Arsenal human experiments that took place from 1948 to 1975. These were similar to, but distinct from, the MK Ultra project and Project 112. So Edgewood Arsenal was a U.S. Army facility located within the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Harford County, Maryland, which is part of the Baltimore metropolitan area. Again, these experiments started shortly after the end of World War II in 1945, and worldwide, but particularly in the U.S., now that we were an undisputed military leader, people realized that the nature of warfare was changing, and they were intrigued by the concept that we were moving from sort of medieval warfare that was always devoted to physical damage of the enemy on one level or another to a more psychological type of warfare, especially as technology for mass communication or long distance communication was improving. There was a lot of potential to mess with the enemy's mind, to impair their decision making, to, as these experiments were dedicated to incapacitate them mentally without killing them, which opened up whole new avenues of being successful in warfare without permanently ending the lives of your enemies, which also allowed you in turn to drastically limit your own casualties. So there's a huge amount of interest over this time period from 1948 to 1975, and these Edgewood Arsenal human experiments were just an attempt to cash in on those theoretical ideas and turn them into something useful for the next conflict. And during this time period, again, we're moving into Cold War with the Soviet Union, and that inherently was a conflict of ideologies. It was a conflict of minds as much or more than it was a conflict of bodies. It was a conflict of technologies. So you can see how what happened at Edgewood was sort of tied in with the broader picture around the evolution of warfare. So again, we're talking about the experiments at Edgewood Arsenal. It's a U.S. Army facility in Maryland, and they were innocuously referred to as the Medical Research Volunteer Program, which is about the most sort of bland sounding name that I can imagine for what they were doing. It didn't even have a cool acronym, right? It doesn't spell out an apt word or something like that. So they were very much trying to get ahead of this with PR and keep it very generic and non-threatening sounding. So most of these Edgewood Arsenal experiments involved low-dose experiments on over 250 different psychochemical warfare agents. They also involved research on protection against those agents using personal protective equipment, using potential antidotes, and other methods for blocking or limiting the effects, or for training soldiers to resist those effects so that they were mitigated in efficacy if the enemy used them. So again, it's called the Medical Research Volunteer Program, but these were not civilians participating. To my knowledge, it was all Army and other military personnel who were recruited to participate in these studies. Okay, so in terms of the chemical agents that these studies examined, we are talking about really deadly, there's a spectrum basically, and we're talking about really deadly nerve agents like sarin and VX, all the way to traditional psychedelics like LSD, to other common psychoactive chemicals like weed and PCP. We're talking about chemicals as common and everyday as alcohol and caffeine. So it was only about 14.5% of the volunteer hours associated with these experiments that was devoted to lethal compounds. Again, most of the experiments involved incapacitating compounds, riot control compounds. Again, those two overlap hugely, and a lot of the volunteer hours, just wanted to emphasize this one more time, were actually devoted to experiments involving how to protect soldiers and civilians from these compounds using personal protective equipment of different types, and training of how to avoid exposure, and after exposure how to deal with these really unsettling effects that chemicals like buzz were capable of producing. So just to reiterate, today we're talking about one of the most interesting chemical agents, in my opinion, that the Edgewood Arsenal experiments investigated, and that is 3-quinnucleotidyl benzilate, abbreviated as QNB, or as we're going with today, BZ or Buzz. Okay, now in terms of the chemical characteristics of Buzz, it was first synthesized as a potential ulcer treatment in 1952 by the pharmaceutical giant Hoffmann La Roche. It is a potent, very long-acting, synthetic deliriant, okay, and the effects typically last 72 hours or longer. In terms of the dosage range that you're looking at, there is obviously a pretty big difference between oral dosage and IV dosage. Most of the experiments that I was able to get information on involved IV administration, and the dose that was considered a reliably incapacitating dose for an adult human was about 7 micrograms per kilogram of body weight. So that was enough to incapacitate your average adult for several days. Remember, those are micrograms. Those are millionths of a gram. Those are not milligrams. So you're talking about doses of a powder that would hardly be visible. You're talking about doses in the same general range as LSD doses, which famously can be applied to blotter paper because they are so minuscule that it requires almost no real quantity, no macroscopic quantity of powder to adhere them to whatever medium you're using so that people can put them in their mouth and absorb the dose. So we're talking about that potent of a chemical. And again, this is synthetic. Unlike the other anticholinergic compounds that I'll reference in today's video, these aren't alkaloids from Belladonna or from Datura or any other nightshade family plant. These are ones that we make in a lab with similar chemical structures. Okay, so in general, if you're not familiar with anticholinergic compounds, these work by blocking the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is very widespread. It's ubiquitous in terms of where its receptors are found in both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So CNS is brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system is the nerves that branch out from there and affect all different organ systems. Now, there are 2 different subtypes of cholinergic receptors, I should say acetylcholinergic receptors. Okay, so there are muscarinic acetylcholinergic receptors and also nicotinic acetylcholinergic receptors. BZ acts on the muscarinic receptors, and it has a really wide spectrum of effects. So in terms of the CNS effects, you see impairment of memory and learning, of voluntary motions of all different types, of speech. You also, though, see impairment of many sort of basic somatic, meaning affecting the body rather than the brain, physiologic functions. So again, it was originally synthesized as a potential ulcer treatment. There are huge effects on digestion, on vision. In fact, one of the really scary adverse effects of taking too high a dose of Buzz is that your pupils become so dilated and your vision is so altered that you can go temporarily blind for a few hours or a couple of days, which, given the mental changes, the cognitive and emotional changes that accompany ingesting this substance, you can imagine how terrifying it is, or at least you will be able to imagine that by the end of this video. So anyway, really wide spectrum of mental and physical effects. The anticholinergics do have clinical uses. They reduce muscle spasms. They can help to control excessive saliva production because in terms of the effects on your mucous membranes, they really dry you out. And it can also be used to induce that same muscle relaxation that ends the muscle spasms, but during surgery for that purpose. So in terms of natural alkaloids that BZ's effects are most similar to, I would point to Datura and Belladonna, which I've mentioned already earlier on in this video. So if you're not familiar with Belladonna, some of you know that I speak a little bit of Italian, and Belladonna in Italian literally just means beautiful woman. Okay, and it's a plant, again, in the nightshade family, just like Datura is. And Belladonna got its name because for hundreds of years, Italian women, especially high-class women in terms of their socioeconomic status, they realized that women who are really interested, when they're talking to, say, a suitor, their pupils get bigger, right? They recognize that there was this sympathetic nervous system activation, and that when your pupils were really big, first of all, they thought it was kind of inherently beautiful because your eyes get really like reflective and sparkly, but they also understood that it showed interest in whatever was being talked about, or just as commonly, who was talking about whatever was being talked about. So sort of to up their game when they were, again, dealing with suitors, and in that kind of situation, they would go to their local kitchen witch, and they would get an extract or a preparation of belladonna, and they would apply it to their eyes to dilate their pupils for a few hours. So really interesting, history on the uses in the Italian culture of hundreds of years ago of belladonna alkaloids. Now, the two sort of most talked about belladonna alkaloids are atropine and scopolamine. And I don't want to rant too much here, but I have seen so many YouTubers make videos about scopolamine, even otherwise scientifically reasonably credible people made videos about scopolamine and talk about how it turns you into a zombie, how you become so suggestive that your entire free will is negated. And if you hear someone, especially someone without a scientific background, telling you this, that is an indication, when they're talking about scopolamine in this way, that you should never ever listen to anything that they have to say about human physiology, about human medicine and biochemistry, because it's total BS. First of all, one of the most overarching criticisms of that interpretation of scopolamine's effects is that, the entire concept of free will is neurobiologically dubious. There was a convention a few years ago, maybe more like 10 years ago now, I believe at UCSB, University of California at Santa Barbara, which has a great neurobio and neurochemistry program. And they did a survey of the participants who were some of the most renowned neurobiologists in the world, and over half of these respondents said, yeah, we wish this wasn't true, but we don't see any scientific basis for a belief in free will, and in fact we see a lot of evidence to the contrary. We've known for a couple of hundred years that if you get an injury to the right part of the brain, say a railroad spike, in the famous Phineas Gage case study, a railroad spike, I believe it ended up pressing on his amygdala or something like that. There are a few cases like these that are sort of similar, and so I think it was the amygdala in Phineas Gage's case, and that neural structure has to do with rage and aggression coming out of fear especially, and overnight people with injuries affecting that area of the brain become much more, they can go from very docile and pleasant to really pretty aggressive and even sometimes somewhat dangerous. So in that kind of case, obviously you've had a radical alteration to your behavioral patterns that is not, that you can't resist with your quote unquote free will, right? And we also know now, we've got decades of research showing that different mutations have essentially the same effect on both positive pro-social behaviors and negative antisocial ones. We just can't see them at the macroscopic level, rather, as we can with the type of injury that we're talking about in Phineas Gage's case. So there is plenty of evidence as well that humans continuously overestimate their ability to control their own behavior, as well as the effects of that behavior on the environment around them. So there are a lot of cognitive biases that support this, in my opinion, erroneous belief in our own agency. And I know that sounds like a crazy proposition if you've never studied neurobiology, you have no background in this kind of stuff, but in my opinion, many, if not most, of the most brilliant people in philosophy and science have articulated that this rejection of free will is true. So David Hume, one of the most important post-Renaissance philosophers, developed a theory of hard determinism that completely rejected free will. Kant was not a hard determinist, but he also saw that there are all kinds of problems with free will. It was one of the co-founders of calculus. I meant to look this up and I forgot to. I believe it was Spinoza, not Leibniz, who was a hard determinist. In terms of contemporary thinkers, Robert Sapolsky at Stanford, who is a primatologist and neurobiologist, who is, in my opinion, to biology what Stephen Hawking was to physics. Sapolsky has developed this theory called the diminishing homunculus of free will, where he's saying, like, okay, we can't exactly disprove the existence of free will, which is almost impossible from an epistemologic standpoint, but what we can say is that the tiny little corner that the homunculus that represents free will is being backed into has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. So there's no evidence to support it, and there is more and more evidence that in a vast preponderance of cases, free will is not what we would hope for it to be. We've also, for a long time, it was thought that maybe quantum uncertainty could lead, as it sort of acted at greater and greater levels of organization on biologic organisms, that it could explain free will. But we know now that's not true. If that were true, then, for example, like if quantum uncertainty led to macroscopic uncertainty, Newtonian physics couldn't exist. We wouldn't be able to predict the trajectory of an object being launched at a certain angle and with a certain initial velocity, because that uncertainty that was building up from the quantum level all the way to the microscopic, all the way up through the macroscopic, the world that we can see, that would be once in a while you would get a really unexpected outcome. Like you would throw the ball and you'd be expecting it to go maybe 30 meters, and instead it just like gets the velocity drops off so quickly with no external explanation, it just falls to the ground, right? So again, no, this is a total tangent, but if someone is talking to you about the effects of scopolamine and they say that it removes free will, they probably don't know what they're talking about, even if you believe in free will. All right, so with that little tangent aside, we are talking about a chemical, again, buzz, that is similar to the effects of plants like Datura and Belladonna, and the Belladonna alkaloids, atropine, and scopolamine. Now, in terms of the toxicity, in terms of the effects that this has on your physiology, especially if you take too much of anticholinergic compounds like BZ, there is a mnemonic, and the mnemonic goes mad as a hatter, which is the delirium that it produces. Blind as a bat, which is referring to the pupil dilation that I mentioned before. Red is a beet, the flushed skin that you get. Hot as a hair, you get fever, partly because your ability to sweat is seriously compromised. Dry as a bone, again, it dries out your mucous membrane, so you get dry mouth, again, reduced sweating. And full as a flask, you also get urinary retention. So now we're going to go into sort of the step-by-step effects in every stage after dosing of BZ with some really detailed examples that is just intriguing, okay? So if you had to kind of summarize the effects, you alternate after you've taken BZ between slumber, almost like a coma in some cases, and this agitated, completely dysfunctional delirium. In the words of the Edgewood article on BZ, they say, quote unquote, you're immersed in fugue-like waking dreams. Now, again, it's important to understand, even when we're talking about really powerful psychedelics like LSD, which I always compare to stepping into Starry Night, even when we're talking about such potent compounds as those, you remember almost always that you're tripping. And when we say you hallucinate on LSD, it's mainly, particularly at reasonable dosages, it's mainly like you see patterns superimposed on everything. Your body is distorted. There's all kinds of overlay of cool images and patterns, but it's not so much that you're just outright hallucinating entities that aren't there, and it's not usually that you're interacting with them in any kind of detailed or extended way. It's just not like that for the vast majority of people, the vast majority of the time. That's very different to the effects of a chemical like BZ that causes what we call frank hallucinations. Again, it's more of a delirium than your classic psychedelic set of effects, and it is definitely a case of frank hallucinations where you are straight up seeing things that are not there, talking to things that aren't there, extended interactions with objects and entities that have no basis at all in the physical environment around you. Now, Edgewood had a really interesting quote about this. They said, if asked for explanation of their bizarre behavior, subjects will often give perfectly reasonable explanations, providing that one is really being harassed by a 4-foot-long rabbit, of course. So in terms of onset, the effects typically begin within 1 hour. So at first, most subjects fall asleep. And in fact, if you give people a low dose of BZ, sometimes that's all that happens. They feel a little weird. They go to sleep. They often sleep for longer than is typical for them. And they wake up maybe with some lingering just sense of things being not quite right, but not anything that qualifies as like a trip that they could, where they've got significant symptoms or effects for an extended period. However, when you give a dose that's enough to be at that above that incapacitating threshold that we talked about of 7 micrograms per kilogram on average, the person will fall asleep, and sometimes they'll fall into a sleep so deep that it will last like 8 to 12 hours and be almost coma-like. After that, they awake in this highly altered state that we're going to talk about in a minute. But one really interesting thing about the stage where you're in stupor or slumber, which can kind of alternate throughout the experience with more active waking states for some people who take BZ. One of the interesting things about it is that there's this thing that the people who are tripping on it show called obstinate progression, and that means like they're trying to move and they're moving as though all these barriers between them and whatever they're trying to get to, which most of the time the researchers observing these people who were tripping couldn't even figure out. And this behavior is really similar to or reasonably similar to something called the running response in animals that are decorticate. So that means animals that have lost higher brain function in different areas. They will often have what's called just a running response, and the reason that's so significant is because people figured that once you lost the cortical input and your higher brain function, voluntary motion that was complex, like running somewhere, wouldn't be possible. And so what this response in decorticate animals showed was that some running responses are controlled by like the lower brain, the lower brain and the spinal cord. And obstinate progression it is similar to that running response in that it's not clear what stimulus is eliciting obstinate progression effect, and it's very obvious that the person isn't functioning at a high cognitive level, but still they're able to crawl and sort of keep their goal in mind in the same way that people with certain types of higher brain function damage are able to, even though according to our traditional neurobiology they shouldn't be able to. So just kind of a quick note there. So after that stage of stupor, of deep slumber, the person is getting more and more active and their speech returns. Now, from what the researchers have said, and I'll talk about the sources for this info at the end of the video, and I'm going to link them all in the video description. But in terms of what the researchers said, it's almost worthless to ask questions and to listen to someone who is on buzz. It's just like, it's nonsensical. It can sound very witty because it's just like these odd, very like explosive outbursts of free association of ideas where just one thing goes to another, and there's this very tangential relation between each of them, but like the overall arc of speech makes no sense whatsoever. Sometimes it's like the phonetic similarities in a lot of different pathological brain states. You get a lot of alliteration, so a lot of repetition of the first sounds of words. It's usually that more so than traditional rhyming, which involves, of course, the syllables at the ends of the words. But so you get this really bizarre speech, and sometimes you'll ask someone a question and the researchers said like they won't answer in any clear way, but then 3 questions later they'll suddenly circle back to the first question and give a non-answer. So really interesting change in patterns of speech. Now these next effects, these are common. So this isn't just one person who was tripping and did something bizarre and funny, but like many people who took these substances, and think of the time when these experiments were being done, at which point like well over 50% of Americans smoked. A lot of the people would end up smoking fake cigarettes. They would also talk, have extended interactions with people who weren't there in great detail with proper pauses for the other person to speak in response. Now, the researchers are always considering, could this be the power of suggestion? Could this be people trying to trick us? And they said there was absolutely no doubt in any of the researchers' minds that these interactions were real in the heads of the people who were tripping on buzz. They were just way too detailed and way too perfectly coordinated time-wise to be faked. So really, really interesting. Also, another common thing was like, especially if there was a large, tall object in the vicinity of the person who was tripping on BC. For example, there was a simulated gun mount in one of the experimental setups. They would often treat it as a person. There was another person who was approaching just a little drinking fountain, and they said, "Excuse me, sir," and stuff like that. Like stuff like I would pay to be one of these researchers jotting down all of the observed interactions with supposed or perceived entities that weren't really there. Like, what a cool job. But Yeah, these are, I think of them as like action movie type hallucinations. One of the participants was screaming to throw down a shotgun and some shells. And remember, these are military people in essentially a medical or a military setting. So that makes sense in terms of the content of the hallucinations matching up with the setting that the drug taking was happening in. There was another person who was calling for help for some sort of medical emergency. Again, pretty dark hallucinations. A lot of hallucinations involving dead people. And just not very many uplifting hallucinations in terms of the entities being observed or sort of the messages being conveyed. A lot of scary, aggressive, or defensive themes to these hallucinations. So I'm going to read now just a short paragraph from one of the soldiers who signed up for this series of experiments. This particular soldier, I believe, was involved in more than one experiment with BZ. It's really interesting that many of them returned despite how frightening these experiences could be. But this is what he said. He said, "I will now describe some of the dreams I had. There was supposed to be an inspection in the barracks by a general, and I had just come back from leave. I was trying to get ready for it. The only difficulty I had was I could only find one boot, so I put on a pair of shower shoes. When the general saw them, he asked why I was wearing them, and I told him that I was under orders from a doctor not to keep my feet enclosed, but rather to let the air at them. He believed me and left the room. In the same dream, I had a girl waiting for me down the hall. I wanted to go out and see her, but the nurse wouldn't let me, so after trying to fight my way out and failing, I called the MPs, the military police, who promptly arrested them. After that, I found out that they were going to beat me up, so I tried to make friends with the one who appeared to be the leader. It must have worked because I don't remember a beating." Now, it's really interesting to me that the parts of the book about these experiments that I read don't really comment on, but that these write-ups from the people who actually tripped make clear a lot of people have interactions with former boyfriends, well, mainly because they were all men, former girlfriends, just like more so than other loved ones. There seems to be a fixation on romantic relationships, either current ones or ones that didn't pan out. I think that's so interesting in terms of, you think of these young, some of them like playboy military guys, in terms of what was on their mind and why this would have been true for them, as opposed to all the other potential figures that they could have hallucinated, right? But again, that's something that seemed evident to me, but just based on the few the few trip reports that I was able to read. Also, and this is one of the coolest things about it, that again distinguishes buzz from some other hallucinogenic substances, is there are a lot of hallucinations that involve distortions of scale. So one of the researchers said that the coolest thing he observed in the course of these experiments was this guy who was describing in like incredibly vivid detail this Lilliputian, this miniature baseball game going on in front of him on a plain little hospital bed, I think it was. He was hallucinating like specific, like consistent players on each of the teams. He could call out all of the how many strikes the person had, and how many people were on which bases, and when the researcher would prompt him a little bit to explain what had happened in the game since the last check-in, like he would describe it in vivid detail. It was clear that he was seeing this baseball game unfold with these tiny little players on the bed in front of him, and he was very accurately, or not accurately, but you know what I mean, very consistently able to detail what he was seeing in this hallucination that lasted quite a while. So some of the most frightening trips, though, went in the other direction. And it was noted that a lot of times the hallucinations would go from smaller toward the beginning of the onset of effects to much bigger later on, especially as the outside environment got darker. People would tend to see huge creatures, huge entities, either people or mythical creatures, or sometimes animals like maybe extinct animals like dinosaurs or giant saber-toothed tigers, and these would be frighteningly large. And again, these people cannot remember, almost all of them couldn't remember why they were altered. So, I'm going to talk about the confabulation which these people who are tripping used to try to explain to the researchers why they were, so crazy. You can tell that impulse to not seem crazy was preserved even in the ones who were tripping really, really hard, But so these these alterations of sense of scale that happen with these BZ hallucinations, they can go in both directions. And some of the scariest experiences that people had on BZ involved hallucinations where the things that they were hallucinating were gigantic creatures that, of course, they could have been chasing them. They could have been, the people who were tripping might have been hiding from them. Okay, so that kind of thing. Some of the participants also described an almost MDMA-like focus on touch. I think it's probably because their vision was so disturbed by their pupils being so big, which if you never tripped, that can make your vision blurry. It can do all kinds of things that affect your depth perception. So I guess in a way it made sense that these people were running their hands over everything that they could see. And I imagine that the textures of certain materials were very much altered, and that there was a lot of like fascination on their part. So that's not unusual at all for a hallucinogenic compound. It reminded me, again, in terms of what it would look like as a researcher observing it, it reminded me a lot of MDMA, although I bet you that it wasn't as pleasurable for these people who are tripping as feeling things like Velcro or wallpaper is for people, especially who are taking MDMA for the first time. Now, another thing, when they asked people to draw and write, many of the people who are tripping displayed micrographia. That's a symptom that's also seen in schizophrenia and other organic mental illnesses. So, they would write really, really small and cramped to the point that it was almost totally illegible. What's really interesting too is that they would hallucinate a red color to their own skin and to others' skin. The researchers thought that this might be caused by the dilation of blood vessels in the retina, so that there was actually a direct physiological explanation for why their own skin and the skin of the people around them looked so reddish. So thought that was really interesting too. Again, there was this confabulation. That's kind of like making up lies to cover a mental deficiency. So one of the signs that people were coming back to reality, say maybe after 48 hours or 50 hours or 55 hours, like they would start to realize, wow, something is really messed up and I don't know why. And when they were asked questions about what was going on with them, they would confabulate. They would make up all these excuses about why they were seeing and feeling the things that they did. And they would also, they become aware that it was a different day than what they expected. Time stood still for most of these people who are tripping. So they would finish tripping maybe 3 days after being administered buzz. And then on that third day, they would think it was still Friday instead of Monday or Tuesday, for example. And when asked about this, they would try to cover it up with all kinds of confabulary strategies. Not sure the adjective form of confabulation, but yeah, they would just, they would say things like, oh, I must have just been so tired from drilling last week that I just passed out for 2 days and time, passed me by. They would say things like that. They would say that maybe they had been sick the week before and they got blood poisoning by bacteria, and that's why they were so out of it. Like they would start to invent, reasons for why they were so impaired, and in the absence of knowing that they had been administered this drug, a lot of times they resorted to illness or tiredness or whatever the case may be. But that was often a sign that they were actually recovering from the effects of buzz. Now that typically came after the stage, sort of maybe midway into, after they've woken up from the slumberous state. They go into the full-blown hallucination state. A lot of the time they can hardly move while they're in that state. People have a lot of trouble going to the bathroom. So again, the buzz made them retain their urine, but many participants ended up wetting themselves. And as they were in that really intense phase of hallucination after they woke up, about halfway through, many people would reach a stage that resembled paranoid schizophrenia in terms of what they were thinking about. A lot of delusions of grandeur, where they might be a savior of mankind or even God, a lot of persecutory delusions. So there was a sweet spot in terms of using buzz to model schizophrenia, which again was never really feasible, but there was a lot of interest in. There was a sweet spot in the middle to, I guess, final third of the trip where the symptoms did resemble, at least from the outside, those of paranoid schizophrenia. And, after that came this confabulation as people were coming back to themselves and realized that something was seriously wrong, but that they weren't able to grasp what was wrong yet. if that makes sense. Now, important to emphasize on many levels that some of these changes in people's emotions and people's perceptions were potentially dangerous to the people who were tripping as well as the people around them. So there were multiple participants at different dosage levels who became violent against the researchers. Now, as always, there's a really huge impact. I think it was Tim Leary who originally talked about the impact of set and setting. One of those psychedelic pioneers. Maybe it was Terence McKenna too. But what that means is like the environment that you're in and your mental state going into it, as well as your own personality, your background, your childhood, all of these things profoundly influence the character of any psychoactive experience, but particularly a hallucinogenic psychoactive experience. Okay, so again, in this case, people became violent. They thought their lives were in danger, and they reacted accordingly with attempts to use deadly force. And it was really, a lot of them became resentful, suspicious as they're waking up to, wow, I messed up. I'm in this facility. I don't know how I got here. They started acting really reticent and really like they were planning something, probably their own escape in a lot of these cases. So, it is not a benign state to enter. And again, it's not clear whether this was brought out in these people who are tripping because of something inherent in their own personality and life experience, because they were in a military setting and they knew it, or a military medical setting is probably a better description. So the nurses and the other researchers, like, they did try to keep things calm and copacetic, but they couldn't hide the fact that these people were essentially being contained in one area and being administered this substance that really made a lot of them have dark hallucinations. So it's not clear. I'm being really long-winded. It's not clear that if you took BZ, outside while camping with friends, that would have such tendency to lead to physically aggressive behavior. But to me, based on my vibe, based on some decently extensive reading about buzz, I think it is intrinsic to the chemical itself. I think many people will have potential to be aggressive and violent on it. Okay, so now in terms of again, the addictive potential, this stuff is not addictive. But what's really interesting is that even after bad experiences, many of the Army volunteers came back for more. So that might be out of a sense of duty. They understood that at some point this kind of agent could be deployed against U.S. troops, and they genuinely wanted to help the U.S. prepare for that eventuality. Might also be my personal chemical credo of anywhere is better than here, here being sobriety, which I lived by mostly during my 20s. Not a great way to get ahead in life, but it was how I felt in regard to my native neurochemistry, so it is what it is. So a lot of questions about also the long-term effects of buzz, because one of the things that finally shut down the Edgewood Arsenal experiments was just it blatantly unethical by today's standards, but they didn't even track these people properly to see. There's some evidence that some of the people who took the anticholinergic compounds, LSD, PCP, that they had permanent effects. Some of them became schizophrenic. Some of them had what we would call HPPD, kind of persistent changes to their perception from taking high doses of psychedelics. And again, it's impossible to analyze and sort of definitively separate how much of it is an individual's predisposition to having those problems that was triggered by the substance, and how much of it was just the substance actually causing those problems where they wouldn't have been possible for an individual to experience if they hadn't taken the substance. So if that makes sense. But the thing with the Edgewood Arsenal experiments is that they didn't even try, and eventually when these experiments became public, there was huge outcry about how American soldiers were being treated, again, about the lack of follow-up, about just the idea that this is kind of a scummy thing to do to the people who are risking their lives to defend our country, whether they're consenting to it or not. It doesn't really pass medical muster, especially when the Hippocratic Oath is centered on this idea of first do no harm, right? There's quite a bit of evident potential harm and actual harm if you read how these experiments were conducted and how people reacted to them. So, guess the final thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is so the stated theory of studying these compounds was that they could be useful against enemy soldiers. That was the primary justification. Again, you could incapacitate them for 2 or 3 days, kind of confuse them, limit their mobility hugely, just mitigate their ability to, say, accurately fire a firearm and things like that, to execute complex military maneuvers. As you probably know from listening to these trip reports in the previous 40 or 50 minutes, like, none of that would have been possible. So if you could disperse this stuff at the proper dosage without killing people through overdose, you could really shut down an enemy's troops, again, potentially without having to take as many casualties and at a distance, right? But my belief, based on my research, is that mainly buzz was investigated for domestic use. It seems so much more likely to me that the military was they did acknowledge that part of it was motivated by trying to develop new riot control methods, but I think it makes much more sense in terms of the domestic population. First of all, in terms of how we would be able to distribute this substance, maybe put it in the water supply in an area or something like that, but you could just totally confuse people. You could prevent them from banding together. Again, they wouldn't be able to execute any complex plans at all. You could physically discombobulate them, and hugely, you could turn them against each other. You're confusing them, you're incapacitating them, and because they get this paranoid ideation, because they know that something's wrong, and they get these persecutory delusions, you're turning them against each other. So they're not going to be able to resist you effectively. These people who are maybe rioting or something like that, they're not going to be able to resist you effectively, and they're going to turn against each other. So that is such a sinister strategy, but such an effective one. And yeah, I guess you could use that on an enemy's military population, or even more so an enemy's civilian population. If you could somehow get this, administered to an enemy civilian population, you could really knock them out for 3 days, roll in with your own military, and by the time they came out of it, you'd basically, it would be an accomplished fact. You'd be in control of them. So I think a lot of the motivation was for potential, control of domestic disturbances. During part of this time, there were a lot of anti-war protests involving the Vietnamese War and things like that. And I think the military was probably primarily motivated by that, or the US government, I should say, was primarily motivated by that, because they know that killing your own citizens, no matter how sort of vehemently they're protesting, is a terrible look that is very likely to turn against you. But if they could use this, especially if they could use it at a low dose with plausible deniability, therein lay the true potential power of buzz and some of these other anticholinergic and psychedelic agents. So buzz, BZ, has gained a really infamous reputation from a book called Acid Dreams about the US government's psychedelic experimentations, and also from a movie called Jacob's Ladder. Now, Jacob's Ladder alleged that the US Army soldiers, some of them were given BZ during their deployment during the Vietnamese War, the Vietnam War, I should say. So they thought that soldiers were potentially being given low doses to make them more aggressive, to make them sort of delirious, to an extent that they weren't properly taking into account risk to their life and things like that, that they would, again, take risks that they wouldn't normally take, that kind of thing. Now, this doesn't make much sense to me. It was very clear early on in these experiments that this compound was not harnessable in that way. You wouldn't ever want to give it to troops who you needed to be able to follow orders, which is like all troops, as far as I know, although I'm not a military expert. So the Jacob's Ladder hypothesis, in my opinion, is very unlikely to be true, and there is certainly no definitive evidence that U.S. soldiers in Vietnam or anywhere else were given buzz. But despite that, there have been theories of BZ use in Syria, Bosnia, Russia that have cropped up periodically. There is also an interpretation of, if you're a millennial like me, especially an older generation millennial, you remember that in 2002, when I was 14, there was this Moscow theater incident. It was called the Nord-Ost siege, and there were these Chechnyan separatist rebels, and they took over this theater and they held all of the theater goers hostage. And at the end of it, it was pretty clear that some chemical agent had been deployed, and there were 115 hostages dead. And it was thought that those 115 were killed by whatever chemical was used. Now, some people have suggested that the chemical used was 3-quinnucleotinyl benzilate, BZ. Again, doesn't make sense to me based on my current understanding of how BZ works, based on the relatively high amount you would need to administer to someone to cause an overdose, especially if you're not able to inject them with it, which obviously they weren't, since this was done when the Chechnyan rebels were still in control of those hostages. So doesn't make much sense to me, but I guess worth mentioning for the historical context and just the theories that have been put forth over time in different scenarios that the US government really has deployed BZ. They have certainly done crazier things and not taken accountability for it. So I would never just rule it out. All right, guys, so thank you so much for making it this far in the video. If you enjoyed this and you're interested in similar content, please consider liking and subscribing. I have interviews again devoted to the really powerful hallucinogen ibogaine, which has shown huge promise in getting people off of opioids and kind of resetting the opioid receptor system. Have a couple of interviews coming up on YouTube and my blog on that topic. I also, as I mentioned at the start of the video, have other informational videos planned on these sort of esoteric and atypical psychoactive chemicals, including delirious and other psychedelics. If you're interested in further reading on the topic of the Edgewood Arsenal experiments, I am going to link the resources that I read in preparation for this video in the video description. There is a wonderful book called Secrets Almost Forgotten. It's called Chemical Warfare, Secrets Almost Forgotten by James Ketchum, who is a medical doctor who is involved as one of the researchers in these experiments. There is a free PDF available online that I'm going to link to. There's also, it's a shorter text, a treatise on incapacitating agents by the same Dr. Ketchum, as well as another, I believe, researcher whose last name is Sidell. I'm going to give you that link as well. Also, there was a chemist who has admittedly worked with the CIA, I believe during the 60s and 70s. His name was James Moore, Dr. James Moore, and he is described as a quintessential chemist. One time someone was interviewing him and he showed up and Dr. Moore had in one hand a flask with something really like some really dangerous chemical in it, and in his other he had a flask filled with drinking water that he was sipping from. So really wild guy, and he accidentally exposed himself to a low dose of BZ during his CIA sponsored experimentations. I'm going to link to transcription. Actually it's not a transcription, it's just a photo of his notes from that experience, and a write-up by I think one of his students or another chemist who had interacted with him, who wrote an introduction about Dr. Moore's CIA sponsored experiments. So yeah, I'll put all that in the video description, and thank you again for tuning in. I really appreciate you guys, and I will catch you next time.